Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russell Mead, Tablet news writer, Global View columnist at The Wall Street Journal, and distinguished fellow at Hudson. Walter, sometimes there's only one news story, and today seems like one of those days. So in place of our regular programming, I'm going to toss some common theories at you about last night's presidential debate, and you can disentangle them for us and tell us what's plausible versus what's conspiracy, and also just separate the signal from the noise and tell us what really matters in all of this. Are you game?
Sure, let's give it a shot. See what happens.
All right, so 4 theories about last night. Theory number 1, the reason the Biden team insisted on a June debate 3 to 4 months earlier than usual is that they knew Biden would perform as badly as he did and wanted it to happen as far away as possible from November 5th, by which point it would be a distant memory. Theory number 2, the reason the Biden team insisted on a June debate is that they knew Biden would perform as badly as he did and wanted it to happen after the primary process but before the convention so that delegates would have the opportunity to swap him out as the nominee for someone else. Theory number 3, the reason the Biden team insisted on a June debate 3 to 4 months earlier than usual on a favorable network with favorable moderators, no live audience, etc., was that they thought Trump would refuse to accept these terms and they could then paint him as refusing to debate at all, but instead Trump unexpectedly accepted and Biden got boxed in. And then theory number 4, none of this was planned for. The Biden team sincerely thought that with favorable circumstances and a full week for the president to prep, maybe he wouldn't do great, but at least they'd be able to get through it, and they never thought it would be this bad. Walter, what say you?
Well, I say theory 4 seems incomparably the strongest, that they could not have imagined it would be this bad. They might have worried there would be a couple of moments or whatever, but that kind of cascade of the opening, 20 minutes, with sort of the entire country, the entire world just in a state of shock. They could not have anticipated that this was happening. They may have hoped that Trump would say no, but I think, you never quite, seasoned political operatives, and that's certainly what these are, normally try to have something where you have 2 ways to win. So yes, on the one hand, if Trump backs out because it's a format stacked in your favor on a network that loves you, well, okay, you win that way. He's afraid to debate. But then on the other hand, if he does debate, you've still got the favorable format and the network that loves you. Again, I think Trump surprised them here because there are 2 stories. On the one hand, Biden performed worse, I think, than his team thought he would, and Trump performed significantly better. Let's not say in terms of the factual content of everything that he said in the debate, but in seeming, at least most of the time, to be behaving like a reasonable human being within the framework of the rules.
Where does last night's performance rate for you historically, with Nixon sweating in 1960, Reagan's There You Go Again versus Carter in 1980? I guess what I'm asking is, did we just live through a major moment in American political history, or was this another kind of ephemeral news cycle phenomenon of which there were literally hundreds during a presidential election?
I think 50 years from now, people will still remember this as a low point in in the performance by an American presidential candidate, and especially an American president. But I will say there have been embarrassing moments before. I think the one that impressed me the most at the time, and it's almost 50 years later, and I'm still remembering it, is 1976. I think in the debates between then President Ford and Jimmy Carter, where basically the power and sound went out, and the 2 candidates stood frozen at the podium for something like 20 minutes. I can't even remember. But, it was this, and they couldn't figure out what to do, so they just stood there like statues. And that was when you had a moment comparable to this, of feeling that just somehow the people that ought to know what they're doing and ought to know how to run the show really don't actually seem to understand what's happening or how they should respond.
Next week, we'll get into maybe some of the international implications of some of this. But this week, just sticking on the domestic side, I have to ask because it's on a lot of people's minds today, whether we like it or not. I mean, with Biden clearly in this kind of shape now, and a vice president who maybe doesn't command much authority or loyalty either within the party or among the federal bureaucracy. I mean, what's your theory of how presidential power is being exercised at the moment? Is it a vacuum and the technocrats are in charge? Is Biden actually still in command despite the shape he's in? I mean, how do you see this?
I say my impression is that this is still the Biden administration. And I think, in every administration, you've got all these bureaucratic freelancers. I completely deplore this tendency, but you have all these people who will get a political appointment to some office somewhere in the bureaucracy, and they won't say, okay, I was appointed by Mr. X, Mrs. X, who ran on X platform. And so what I'm just going to do is my loyal level best to implement their vision. And yes, I'll put some of my own little pet theories aside because America will only work if we all work together, blah, blah, blah. How many people actually say, aha, now is my chance to advance my little pet theory? I don't care what the president thinks. I don't care what the secretary thinks. I've had this tremendous internal itch to do something for a decade, and now is my chance. Get out of my way, you peasants. Here I come. And you find that in every administration. It's a character defect that has grown into a political tradition. And so you have this in the Biden administration as well as you certainly had it in the Trump administration, but you had it in the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration. It's not a new thing. But given that, on the whole, does the Commerce Department do what President Biden wants it to do? Yes. Does the State Department do what the president does? Yeah. Again, you get a lot of rebelling and some grumbling and so on, the occasional resignation, but the machine moves in the direction that the president wants the machine to go in. It can be a good idea, it can be a bad idea, but I think we overestimate in this country. We've developed a cult of the incredibly engaged president, and I think in some ways this is JFK, the idea the president was doing 50-mile walks and he was doing, he was up at 4 a.m. and works till after midnight, and it's a frenzy, and he could speed read and all of this. Of course, we know now one of the reasons why he was trying to save all that time was he had some other activities in mind that were time consuming in their own way. But there was this idea that, that's what a president is like. But, I look back at Reagan and everybody's, contrast Reagan and Carter. Everybody said that, oh, Ronald Reagan is lazy and doesn't do anything. But what Reagan did was he had some big ideas, big themes that he wanted his administration to be about, and he watched those. Jimmy Carter spent a lot of time literally scheduling who got to use the tennis courts in the White House because no one else could settle these staff disputes in the right way. Getting a good staff that can do what you need to have done and keeping them a little bit terrified of you is important to be a president. I think, Donald Trump was in charge of the Trump administration. Few people would disagree with that. And, his appointees lived in terror of what would come up next on, what would his next tweet be. But he was watching cable news. He was hanging out with friends. He was not doing a 9 to 5 or, 9 to 9 grind like some, junior level investment banker. So we need to think of the presidency as setting a direction much more than, fiddling with every tiny little detail. And when you think of it that way, even somebody like this president, who obviously at some moments is less than fully focused, but at others, I think, can be, and certainly has some big ideas. Again, I look at Israel policy and see in many ways how he has imposed, both for good and for bad, his vision on on officials who, if they had control, would probably take it in a different direction. So he is still in control of the administration. Now, sort of more fundamental question would be, is he still doing good, sharp, deep thinking? Because if that's the one thing that a president has to do that other people don't, which is, how do I see, where should we be steering this ship of state? And sometimes you outsource it. You might have a Henry Kissinger or someone like that who's giving you advice or whatever. But the president still has to choose between conflicting visions, articulate his own vision, and build national consensus behind it to the extent possible. And the real question is, President Biden still able to do that? And that, assuming that the president stays on the Democratic ballot through November, that's really, I think, the question that people need to be asking.
Well, just to revisit that point before we move on, I mean, as someone who understands the political process better than a lot of the rest of us, do you think the Democrats are basically stuck with Biden as long as he is still committed to being the nominee? Does the party have any actual options to explore a different candidate against Biden's preferences? I mean, how does this stuff with the convention and the delegates actually work?
As far as I understand the process, those delegates are legally pledged to the delegates who were elected as Biden pledged delegates in the primaries are required to vote for the president on the first ballot unless he withdraws. And if he doesn't withdraw, now it's true that, I mean, what's going to necessarily happen to you? The Chicago police are not going to be there to arrest every delegate who breaks their solemn pledge to the electors of Rhode Island or whatever it might be. So you could certainly, it's not past the realm of imagination that people would do that. This would be very tough, though, for a party that talks about the evils of January 6th and false electors and all of that kind of thing. And it is a little bit like, wait a minute, we are substituting the will of the elite for the will of the voters. So it's not easy. And there is, as people say, the problem of the vice president. It would seem to be, if, for example, you invoked the 25th Amendment and declared the president wasn't able to continue with his duties, the vice president steps in. I'm sure that from the vice president's point of view, that's what you should do if the president can't be renominated. I mean, we obviously have the designated successor and heir right here. And is your misogyny or is your racism going to prevent you from seeing the merits of the natural successor? Are you going to sort of violate, blah, 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 blah. It's just difficult. The Democratic Party is at this point, a much better organized political party than the Republican Party is. Donald Trump sort of blew the traditional Republican establishment out of the water in 2016, and everything that's happened since then has simply confirmed the impotence of the traditional Republican establishment and the sort of chaotic dominance of the Trump wing. The Democratic Party still has some important structures. You have big city political machines, which are very pragmatic in a certain way. Yes, their teachers' unions may be very left-wing in a lot of their ideas, but these people want to win elections because the state of California had something like, $100 billion potential budget deficit or something. They want things like, they want that SALT state and local tax deduction restored because they are hurting. They need the money. So there are good chunks of the Democratic Party that want to win elections. Personally, by the way, I think this is good. I actually think having politicians who think that winning elections is more important than fine points of ideology actually is one of the things that can make a democracy healthy. Now, you get a certain amount of sleaze and corruption with this, but you know what? You get a kind of certain sleaze and corruption with the rule of the zealous and the pure. This is not a knock on the Democratic Party to say that it's more organized, and so I could imagine a kind of coalition of these factions in the Democratic Party saying, "Listen, keeping Donald Trump out of the White House is important. We all need to work on this. And unfortunately, the prospective nominee may not be up to the job. So we're going to have to do something." Now, the difficulty is always going to be to agree on what you're going to do. It's one thing to say, we can't really work with President Biden anymore, but who is number two? Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer? Is it Kamala Harris? I mean, there are a lot of people that might say, well, I'm really the future of the Democratic Party. Will the left wing and the progressives be able to agree with the centrists and the more conservative Democrats, et cetera, et cetera? And will a perception that the process is rigged or in some other way is the party bosses getting together, does that then make it a steeper climb uphill for the nominee? Let's not forget that before the debate, President Biden was actually running more or less even with Trump. I mean, really, the polls were basically within the margin of error pretty much everywhere. And it was anybody's race. Now I suspect the next rash of polls we'll see will look more discouraging for the president. But can you be so sure that in September, October, we'll still be where we are now? The summer, is a long time. Things happen. We don't know. But I can see several paths to how the Democrats could get to a place of replacing Biden, some of them even without the president agreeing to be replaced, but all of them are difficult.
All right, final question. And I know I said at the beginning that there's only one story in America today, but in fact, shortly before we started recording, the Supreme Court handed down two huge decisions, which we'll talk more about next week. But in one ruling, they ruled that the Justice Department overstepped by charging hundreds of people who rioted at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. And in another decision, overruled the Chevron doctrine, which accounts for a lot of what the federal administrative state does. So with Trump benefiting from what happened in the polls last night, at least in the last 24 hours, it seems like he might be on at least the temporary roll. We won't hold you to it, but at least as of now, what is your prediction for where we're headed in November?
Well, I did see somebody had a very snarky comment on Twitter that this was the worst 24 hours for the Democrats since Appomattox. It is kind of a roll. It's funny. Talk about the news dump, the Supreme Court putting those big decisions out today while the whole country is still reeling over the debate was excellent timing is all I can say. Obviously, this is going to intensify it. It raises the stakes of the election and it intensifies the passions around the election. Personally, I think that they did overstretch the statute in their eagerness to find a big stick to hit the January 6th people with. That was, I feel, unwise, and I think the court actually acted correctly. Now, my understanding of the law is pretty pathetic, so I don't have a British judicial wig on my head as I issue my rulings. But just as a guy who follows the news and has opinions and makes a living off having opinions, I don't think this was an appropriate use of the law, and I'm glad to see it struck down. Chevron case is very interesting for in case we have some listeners who aren't following it super closely, up until this last decision, for about 40 years, the court had held that federal judges sort of had to defer the sort of findings of administrative regulatory bodies, so that, if the EPA said, this is what the regulation should be, it was not so easy for a court to come in and say, no, it can't be that. But the theory is that Congress can't delegate to the executive the power essentially to write laws. So Congress can't say to the Treasury Department or Federal Reserve, we're writing a law that's telling you to go and write whatever law you want to regulate the banking system, or to the EPA, we're writing a law that tells you, who are not elected, to go out there and write what will then have the force of law that governs, what every power company can do, and so on and so forth. I don't actually think that is a healthy place for the country to be. I think what we've seen is that power has inevitably then, first of all, a lot of power goes to the unelected bureaucracy and to civil servants who, under normal circumstances, can't be fired, and whose decisions then is very difficult to review or overturn. But it also goes to the courts, because to the extent that anybody can then rule on what the administrative state does, it is the courts. And the biggest problem, in my view, the biggest problem in our system of government right now is the weakness of Congress. And it is partly because it doesn't organize itself well. It isn't doing its job very well. I think there are problems with staffing, problems with organization. There are things, the hearing system is a very dysfunctional one. The committee system doesn't work the way it really ought to. There are a lot of things that need to be reformed in Congress. In the minds of the framers of the Constitution, and also for about the first 150 years of American history, Congress really was the most important branch of government, and what happened in Congress really drove the train. And the shift to presidential government also meant a shift to a much larger role for the judiciary. And neither of these things is healthy. So, as a kind of a generic directional thing, I am happy to see the administrative state get its wings clipped a bit here. However, we now have a problem that our political institutions, as they currently exist, are not set up to run the constitutional government as our Supreme Court interprets it. So Congress now has got to do a lot better job writing laws than it has done for 50 years. If the EPA can't write all of these regulations, then the Congress has to figure out how to do that. That is going to be a very difficult thing to do. And so I would say that implementing this new doctrine, it's the old doctrine restored, by the way. It's, Chevron deference was sort of a new thing that was put in the 20th century. And what they're saying, which is, by the way, what a lot of what's going on in the court is doing, is saying the mid-20th century jurisprudence that departed from the historical traditional jurisprudence, that was the error, not the traditional jurisprudence. We've now, they put us in a place where, so now you're going to see a lot of regulations challenged. Courts are going to be swamped, and a lot of them, I think, will be overturned under this. Well, we can't live in a country that has no regulations whatever. And so how is Congress going to take up that task? And I wish, Jeremy, that instead of all of us sitting around wondering, which is more objectionable, the farrago of inaccuracies and distortions that was coming out of one candidate last night, or the lack of focus that we saw in the other, I wish we were saying, okay, well, what do the two parties, what do their leaders propose as how are we going to fill this gaping void in our system of governance?
All right, that does it for this week's special debate coverage. We'll be back to regular programming next week. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.